So in this last session of the day, we take up chapter 6, Paul the Apostle and Theologian. So only 2 points we see in this chapter, Paul the Apostle and Paul the Theologian. So first one, Paul the Apostle. Brother was asking why Paul was, or why we call him Apostle. So I will give you the reasons in this first section. First of all, Paul had a very deep Christ experience in a Damascus experience, conversion. And as we have already said, it is a very decisive turning point in the life of Paul, this Christ experience. And he takes it as a direct call from God to become an apostle of the Gentiles, Romans 11:13. And he considered it equal to the call and commissioning of the 12 apostles. Paul himself writes to Philippians 3:12, Christ has made Paul his own. We have already referred in the last sessions. Then he wrote to Galatians about Christ's revelation to him, 1:12-16. So now I would give you some reasons why we call him apostle, or why Paul claims himself as an apostle. Basically, what is the meaning of apostle? One, sent out, called and sent out. So Paul fulfills these two. He is called directly from the Lord and he is sent out as an apostle of Gentiles. Okay, the first reason, apostolic altruism. First reason is apostolic altruism. Reference 1 Corinthians chapter 9:19-23. Now, what do we mean by apostolic altruism? That is, courage to take up risk shown in his preaching, especially to the Corinthians. Paul had very hard time with the Corinthians. Then he had a great appreciation for the members of the churches. Reference 1 Thessalonians chapter 1 verses 2-10. So first one is he had a great courage to risk his own life, as it is shown in his preaching to the Corinthians. Then second one, he had a great appreciation for the members of the churches. He had a great concern for the churches as an apostle. 2 Corinthians chapter 11:28-29. Then we know that Paul had undergone a lot of sufferings like any other apostle. So his sufferings as an apostle we see in 2 Corinthians chapter 11:24-28. His sufferings as an apostle found in 2 Corinthians 11:24-28. Finally, his missionary zeal as found in Romans 15:23-24. So we know all the 12 apostles were suffering, martyred, except John. Everyone was martyred. So also like them, Paul also underwent all these sufferings. Second reason, an apostle committed to the socio-economic welfare of the people. An apostle. Paul is an apostle committed to the socio-economic welfare of the people. That is to say, not only liberation from sin, law and death, but also social equality of Jew and Greek, slave and free, male and female. Galatians 3:28, 1 Corinthians 7:2-7, where he speaks about also the social equality in the society. There is no difference between a Jew, Greek, slave, free, young, old, male, female, and so on. Galatians 3:28, 1 Corinthians 7:2-7. His commitment to help the poor Christians in Judea is seen very much in his life. Paul was always trying to collect money to help the poor Christians in Jerusalem. So he had a great love and commitment to help the poor Christians in Jerusalem. Galatians 2:10. Then Paul also had a genuine concern for the poor. References where Paul had a great and genuine concern for the poor. 1 Corinthians 16:1-4, 2 Corinthians 8-9 chapters, then Romans 15:25-27. See, actually he was inspired by Christ himself who became poor. Third one, the challenges Paul had to face. Paul had to face naturally a lot of challenges in his ministry, in his apostleship. For example, the conflict of ideologies about the identity of Christian movement, which became a climax in Jerusalem Council. Conflict of ideologies about the identity of the Christian movement, the climax reaching in Jerusalem Council. Paul also had a great challenge of presenting the Jewish gospel in the Hellenistic culture. Of course, Paul had an Hellenistic background, but at the same time it was a great challenge to present a gospel to the Hellenistic world. So as we said, since he was a man of two cultures, so it was easier for him, but at the same time it was a challenge. Now, what were the three major challenges Paul had? First one, Judaizing challenge. We will hear a lot about Judaizers who were always troubling Paul. So this is the challenge posed by Jewish Christians, Jews who became Christians. So Paul had to face certain challenges from these Jewish Christians. Now, one of the main challenge was these people were trying to make a Christianity another sect of Judaism. Already Pharisees, Sadducees and Essenes, these are the sects in Judaism. So these Jewish Christians were trying to make Christianity as another sect to Judaism. So which was really a great challenge to Paul to convince them. Paul eliminated completely this idea, and Paul defended it, saying that salvation is through Christ in the accomplishment of God's work, not through merely scrupulous observance of the law. Jesus Christ is salvation. So that is a Judaizing challenge coming from Jewish Christians. Then second one is Greek challenge. Greek Christians, Greeks who, or in other words, Gentile Christians. Okay, Gentiles who became Christians. So from them also there was a great challenge to Paul. Now, as we know, Greek culture, cult gave more importance to wisdom, Sophia or Chokmah in Hebrew. For them, wisdom is everything, knowledge is everything. Knowledge, even knowledge is above God for Greeks. According to them, there is no difference between wisdom of human and wisdom of God. They say the wisdom of God is achieved through human efforts. But for Paul, human wisdom is God's gift, never a human effort. So the human wisdom is God's gift. Whereas for Greeks, it is achieved by one's own efforts. They don't give attribution to God, wisdom coming from God. So for them, it is a human effort, human projection. Reference 1 Corinthians 2, 6 to 16. So this was another challenge from Gentile Christians or Greek Christians. So Paul had to convince them of this. So this led them to egoism. So Paul basically had a Judaizing challenge and Greek challenge. To continue with that, Paul's encounter with the Greeks in Athens. Paul had an encounter with the Greeks. He had a lot of arguments with the Greeks in Athens. Acts 17th chapter presents that. Acts chapter 17, 16 to 34. And Paul also had an encounter with the undisciplined Corinthian church on the same point. Paul also had an encounter with the undisciplined Corinthian church. 1 Corinthians 1, 22 to 23. So as I said just before, Paul had a hard time to educate Corinthians. The third challenge Paul had was Gnostic challenge. First one is the Judaizing challenge. Second one is Greek challenge. Third one is the Gnostic challenge. So this challenge is posed by Gnostics or philosophers. Now the main idea is, for these philosophers, salvation is through intermediary beings, and Christ is considered as one of the intermediaries. Now intermediaries beings like angels or the supernatural beings. So these philosophers all considered Christ as one of the intermediaries, but he is the mediator. So posed a great challenge to Paul, and this we will see in detail when we study the letter to the Colossians. So this was a big problem in the church at Colossae. So we will see that. So Paul warned against this idea in Colossians 2:8. But we will see in detail when we study the letter to the Colossians. So these challenges enabled Paul to reflect on the gospel and the person and the work of Christ. So that's about Paul the apostle. Okay. Now we move to the second point in chapter 6, that is Paul the theologian. To begin with this, first of all, Paul was not a systematic theologian. His writings emerged depending on the demands and the context of the churches. He did not sit down and think and write. Basing on the context, basing on the problems of the churches that he himself found, he was responding to those demands, responding to the questions posed to him, and thus out of these writings his theology emerged. In that sense, Paul is not a systematic theologian. So his writings emerged according to the needs, demands, and circumstances, context of the Christian communities. But at the same time, Paul brought into these writings his profound theological sense. So especially letter to the Romans, very rich in theology, very profound theology we find in some of his letters. I would like to give the general characteristics of Pauline theology. We will just briefly explain one by one. First one, Christocentric, that means Christ-centered. So the theology of Paul is Christ-centered. The gospel of Christ is everything for him. One reference, Ephesians 1:3-10, where Paul says Jesus is the Christ and the Lord. In Christ, with Christ, through Christ. The doxology he gives there. So all his theology is summarized in Ephesians 1:3-10 as Christ-centered. Second one, pneumatological. The theology of Paul also is a pneumatological, spirit-centered. The risen Christ operates through his spirit. The spirit is given us as a guarantee. The spirit is given to us. The spirit of Christ is given to us as a guarantee. 2 Corinthians 5:5. Then Paul mentions the first fruits of the Holy Spirit in Romans 8:23. Then Paul also says that Christian life is a life in the Spirit, Romans 8:1-39, the whole chapter. Then Galatians chapter 1 up to chapter 6:10, where we find about Spirit-oriented ideas and theology of Paul. Okay. Third one is ecclesial. So Christian life is a communitarian reality. The literal meaning of church is assembly, gathering of the people. Today we attribute it to buildings, churches. For us, churches means buildings, constructions. But church means it is a group of people, assembly of the people. That is ecclesia. Ecclesia means assembly, people coming together. The concept of the church evolves, of course, in Pauline theology as universal church, local church, and domestic church. All these three aspects we can find in Pauline theology. Fourth one, radical reflection. That means we are seeing the characteristics of Pauline theology. So another characteristic of Pauline theology is very radical reflections. Even small things he discusses elaborately. For example, the food offered to idols, the dietary laws. But Paul discusses it very often in many letters. He gives a lot of guidelines. So the apparently minor issues are also discussed at the root level. So apparently what seems to be minor issues, small issues, but Paul discusses in his letters at the root level. Example, food sacrificed to idols, spiritual gifts, gift of love, gifts of prophecy and tongues, worship, etc. There are so many other minor issues Paul discusses in detail. Then another example we can give, the letter to the Galatians is a radical reflection on the meaning of the work of Christ, 5 and 6 chapters especially. Then another example I can cite is letter to the Romans. Letter to the Romans is a profound reflection on what the humans are before God and what God has accomplished in and through Christ. That is the summary and substance of the entire letter of Paul to the Romans. Then the fifth characteristic of Pauline theology is open to change and development. So more than 10 years of Paul's theological reflection had a gradual development. Or put this way, Pauline theology had a gradual development. One example I give, that is regarding parousia. What is parousia? Second coming of Christ. We see more emphasis on parousia in his early letters. Then in his later letters, we see more existential thinking about parousia. So in the earlier letters, we see more emphasis is given on parousia, imminent. So Christ is going to come and so on. But later the idea got changed. It was not happening, and so the idea got changed. Then still in the later letters, Paul also adds the cosmic aspect of parousia. That means that parousia applies to the entire world, not only the human beings, but the entire cosmos. So that cosmic idea of parousia also is coming in later letters. See the change of the theology of parousia. In the beginning it was imminent. So Christ is going to come. And then later letters it got changed. And then still later letters the cosmic idea also is added. That is one example. Sixth one, theology of the pilgrim church. That is Christian life between already and not yet. You might have heard this expression. Christian life is between already and yet. We are also in a time between already and yet. Already means salvation has already come. The kingdom has already come, but not yet. It yet to be completed, yet to be fulfilled, yet to be perfected. So we are in that period. So Christian church or life is between already and not yet. That's why we say it's a pilgrim church. We are on a journey towards that perfection of the kingdom or salvation. So we are moving towards that yet. So reference Philippians 3:1 and following. This idea is found there. Philippians 3:1 and following. In other words, we are never in a possession of the entire truth. There is always something to discover in ordinary terms. So that is theology of the pilgrim church. We find theology of Paul. Then seventh one, influence of rabbinic thinking, Jewish thinking. Paul was a Pharisee. Naturally, his theology is very much influenced by rabbinic thinking. So he takes lot of ideas from the Old Testament, which is a Jewish literature. So he had his rabbinic thinking and training. So his rabbinic reflections are found in 1 Corinthians 10:1-5. That is, Paul gives warnings from Israel's history. So he refers to what happened in the Old Testament personalities. So we can learn from them, learn from their mistakes. So Paul gives warnings from Israel's history. Then we have Galatians 3:15-18, another example where Pauline theology is influenced by rabbinic thinking. Galatians 3:15-18. That is where Paul mentions the promise of Yahweh to Abraham. So Paul takes up that theme. Then we have Galatians 4:21-31, where Paul speaks about the allegory of Hagar and Sarah. Then last, another example, Romans 10:4, where Paul says Christ is the end of the law. Paul adds that Christ is the fulfillment of the law. Okay, we have the last general characteristic of Pauline theology, namely antithesis and personification of concepts. Theological concepts like faith, sin, death, and life, these are all personified in his letters. Personified, symbolized. So they mean something else. Death means it's not a physical death, he means alone. It's personified into different meanings. So Paul gives a lot of meanings from that. Light, when he says light, darkness, such expressions, it means lot. Light, not that sunlight. We are children of light, he says. Theological concept, very much personified in Pauline theology. Then antithesis. Paul uses antithesis like life and death, spirit and flesh, light and darkness, first Adam and last Adam. So these kind of antithetical concepts also Paul uses. So to conclude this chapter, so we need to be familiar with the theology of Paul in general, to understand Pauline letters, especially his concepts, his ideas. Okay, he takes a lot of concept ideas from Greek philosophy, Greek poets, Greek philosophers, and he also is very much influenced by rabbinic thinking. He has invariable quotations from Old Testament. So all these we should understand to understand Pauline theology and his letters. Good. Thank you, brothers. Here we end chapter 6.